All right, we're going to be looking at the formative years prior to the Constitution being adopted and what led up to it. I know this is a little bit of a review of one, but you can never get enough real information. So we know that the government failed, that the Articles of Confederation uh, were adopted at the end of, originally at the very beginning of the Revolutionary War. They were ratified by the 13 states come 1781, and it established what's known as a confederation. And confederation simply is kind of a loose. A confederation is kind of a loose um, grouping of entities that have kind of the same interests at heart, but they don't always work very well together. So consequently, confederations usually, like the Confederate States of the United States, or the Confederate States, the former USSR, don't work very well because self-interest and the fact that the parts are more powerful than the whole makes it ultimately something that will fail. We know that Congress had very few powers, and that there was no president or a national court system. And when you look at the structure, um, it's amazing that they came to any sort of uh, agreements at all. Originally, the articles were known as a firm league of friendship. The name United States of America actually came very early, but what was most important among all the states was their own sovereignty and their own independence. So rather than them being proud of being a citizen of the United States, they were more proud of being a citizen of the state of New York or a citizen of the state of Virginia. And when they established Congress, which essentially was a committee of the states, the membership was written in such a way that each state had one vote. So there was one delegate from each of the states. And the small states, in essence, then held the balance of power when it came to the number of small states outnumbering the number of large states. Now, Congress was not like what comes later. Congress was actually a unicameral or a one-house legislature. Congress today is a bicameral legislature. The House, the Congress of the Articles of Confederation is unicameral, and it was up to the states to select the delegates that they wanted to send to Congress. And so you have the states determining who goes, each state having one vote. The selection of the president of Congress was by a congressional delegation, and that was done annually, which meant that it happened every year. And the three major functions handled by the committee involved these three things: foreign affairs, um, which included the receiving of ambassadors, the negotiation of treaties; military, which meant that they were raising an army, and that meant that the federal government had to request from the states uh, the the need or the want to use the troops that would come from the states. And then finally, the financial part was perhaps the real downfall of the Articles of Confederation, because that meant that the federal government had to borrow money from the states, and there was no national currency. And there was also no uniform standard of weights and measures. So the if you look at these three things: foreign affairs, military, and financial, that means that you have a really good exhibition of what weakness is. So there's a great deal of a number of weaknesses when it comes to the articles. So first and foremost, you have the inability of Congress to lay and collect taxes. Secondly, you have the inability of Congress to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Hence, like we saw in the video today, um, New York and Connecticut almost wanted to go to war because of the trade policies that brought both of them into conflict. There was a need for agreement by 9 of the 13 states, so you had to have a supermajority, 2/3, to make any important decision. You had a need for unanimous agreement among the states to amend the articles themselves. What's the likelihood of all the states agreeing, especially in a nation even then as big as the United States? You had no national judiciary, and you had no executive branch. You had one vote per state, regardless of population, which is going to obviously lead to resentment by the large states. You had retention by the states of all powers not expressly given to Congress. And since Congress wasn't given very many powers, guess where the power lay? In the states. There was no power to act against an individual state which got out of line. And finally, the election of delegates was simply for a one-year term. And when it took a while for a delegate to get from wherever they were coming, especially if they were coming from the South, to either Philadelphia or eventually New York and then perhaps Washington, it takes a long time to get there. So that leads us to what's happening in the 8 years or the 9 years that the articles are functioning. From 1781 to 1789, we had economic turmoil. Part of that was because of the bankruptcy of the national government. And the government's inability to do anything led to a post-war depression, which left the farmers. And remember, most Americans at the time are involved in agriculture. The farmers are unable to pay for the debt that they owe. The national government is bankrupt. There's a receipt of only about $2.5 million in dollars valued at that time, when the expectation was that the states would send at least $10 million. That meant that the government was unable to pay interest on the foreign loans, in particular the loans that it had received from France to help finance the Revolutionary War. And there was a defeat of a proposed tariff on imports by one vote. Now, a tariff would have raised revenue for the federal government, but it would come at the expense of trade, especially if the tariffs imposed were too high. Then there was a trade war among the states. States charging a fee to simply trade brought several states close to blows. In many ports, in order to protect national industries, closed their ports to foreign trade in order to, in a sense, that was what we call protectionism. Then we had the states themselves, because remember there is no national currency. The states themselves began printing massive amounts of money, especially those states that found themselves in a precarious economic position. Hey, let's grow our currency. But we know that when the currency isn't backed up by, let's say, any substantial amount of gold or silver, it tends to lose value, and people will require more and more of it in order to compensate for its lack of value. And ultimately, one of the big reasons that we got into an economic turmoil was the fact that some states began to refuse to accept other states' currencies, which left those states very much dead in the water. Now, Shays' Rebellion is and was one of the many insurrections that occurred in the time period, especially after 1785. It was desperate straits for many farmers. And we know that rebellions occurred not only in Massachusetts, but in western Pennsylvania and in western North Carolina, especially among what we call the Scots-Irish. And the rebellion literally, the way we can say it, literally scared the hell out of the powers that be. And though ostensibly it was a local issue to block the foreclosure on farms that owed money, the fact of the matter was Daniel Shays and others led the led the elite to feel that the entire system was under attack. And this also led to the obvious fact that the inability of the federal government to deal with what ostensibly wasn't really a state issue but more of a national issue kind of led people to conclude that the national government itself was an empty vessel. So there were some searches for solutions. Before we get to Philadelphia, we know that there was a call to meet in Mount Vernon, which is in Virginia, in 1785. Virginia and Maryland showed up, and they primarily focused on a discussion of what kind of trade policies would govern shipping on the Potomac River, which separates the two states. That led to a call for a meeting at Annapolis, which is in Maryland, by Virginia in 1786. And 5 states accepted this time, and there was again a discussion of trade problems because again the economy, get the economy going, other things will move. And at this meeting, there was a suggestion by Alexander Hamilton to bring all the states together so that the Articles of Confederation could be revised. So now we get to that epic meeting in Philadelphia in 1787. So I know that some of these are blocked off when I converting from PowerPoint to Keynote. Sometimes pictures especially will explode. So I will lead you through this. There were 55 men in attendance. All the states sent people except for Rhode Island. The first thing they did was adopt rules of organization and procedure. There was 1 vote for each state delegation. There was a vote for a quorum, and they said there would need to be 7 votes or 7 states present to hold a quorum. There needed to be a majority vote to pass measures, and there needed to be a requirement of secrecy, all of which they endorsed. So there is no official record of the proceedings. Knowledge from the action taken at the convention occur from personal notes on the proceedings by James Madison. And the chairman of the convention, by acclamation, was George Washington. So we can see here that most of these were wealthy planners. They were white Protestant males, for the most part, men of wealth and an education. Most of them had college education. They were men of distinction. So many of them there became future presidents. They became future state governors. They became future chief justices of the Supreme Court. They were Revolutionary War veterans. And they, in many cases, had served in colonial assemblies, or they had served as delegates to congresses under the Articles of Confederation. And what happens when we look at these men is that they came to share 4 beliefs. One was a need for a stronger government, stronger national government. Secondly, they had a belief in a republican form of government. Third, they were in agreement with Locke's theory of rights. Now, if you remember Locke's theory of rights, basically the existence of government to guarantee people's natural rights, life, liberty, and enjoyment of personal property, power to the people, which means that the people have the power to make laws, they have to agree to follow the laws, and those who don't are punished as agreed upon by the system. And there should be no restrictions on citizens without their consent. And finally, there was support for Montesquieu's separation of powers. These guys had learned their lessons well. So, where did they get their ideas from? And we're going to be looking at a number of these. Obviously, they looked back, and they looked at the governments of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They also relied on their English heritage, which meant that because they could go all the way back to Roman civil law and then English common law, there was the thought that limited government and limitations on executive authority are very important parts of how a government should operate. They got that from the Magna Carta, which was written in 1215, and the English Bill of Rights, which is a number of documents which comes under the moniker of English Bill of Rights, which was formed or written approximately 98 years earlier in 1689. They also believed in representative government. They believed in bicameral government. They believed that appointment of judges by the crown with no power of removal by the crown was something that could fit well in the American system. And what that leads to, of course, is that though the executive branch may nominate judges and the legislative branch approves judges, no one can remove them except by impeachment, death, or retirement. They also believed that the basic decisions of judges would be on precedent, what's known as common law, what's happened before. And they also felt that authority on many issues should reside at the local level and at the state level. They relied on 4 writers. We have looked at 3 of them, and really these 3 are the most important. John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And into that we'll add William Blackstone, and I added also Adam Smith when we looked at it. And we also know that they were looking at the previous experience of colonial governments. They weren't very good, but we were fortunate to have kind of a laboratory of 13 states because no state under the crown had the same type of government. So colonial governments were colonial charters, which was a statement of agreement between the colonists and a company and the monarch. And the colonial charters also guaranteed certain rights and privileges to those who lived within that charter's boundaries. Most states, if not all states, had 3 branches of government. All the states had a bicameral legislature, with the exception of Pennsylvania. All legislatures had power of the purse, which essentially limited the power of the governor. There was a limitation on the right to vote, which meant that you had to own property in order to vote, and that was pretty much essentially limited to white males. And there was often a requirement of membership in certain churches, so you had to not only be a property owner, but you had to be a church-going property owner. And there was again, a thought that the authority should reside in local governments. And they also believed in the principles that were written in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. They believed in equality, I guess not for women and not for minorities, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the powers the government has should derive from the consent of the governed. Now, I was being a little facetious in that last thing. We have to remember that this is the 18th century. It's a whole different set of values. That they've made it this far and they're discussing a democracy is an amazing thing. So we can't expect everything from them. We would like everything to be, looking back, we'd like to apply today's values to them, but we really can't because it's a whole different situation. Now I'm going to skip this, but this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what a question looked like in 1994. So, what was the agenda? Well, first and foremost, of course, we have the equality issues. This comes about in the battle between the big states and the small states. So there were 2 plans that were entered. One was the Virginia Plan, which was from the big states. And in the Virginia Plan, you had a separation of powers, you had bicameral legislature, you had representation by population, and you had election procedures in which the lower house was elected directly by the people, and the upper house was elected by members of the lower house from a list of nominees from the state legislature. That really seems convoluted, but you have to remember this is 1787. It's a little bit different. And the Virginia plan actually had some other powers that stretched beyond what the articles had. A president, or the legislative branch, had the ability to override vetoes. They also wrote in their proposal that the use of the veto in cases where state laws were in conflict with national laws, the executive should be able to use, or the Congress should be able to use a veto. And they also said that there should be a use of force to make a state obey the national law, and the right to legislate whenever separate states are incompetent. So, from their perspective, there's a lot of top-down interference in how states operate. But I guess that's, the Constitution talks about that each state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. Well, I guess this is the one way that they were kind of doing it. They had a one-term executive. The executive was selected by the legislature. He had the power to execute laws. There was a national judiciary, and also that was coming through the selection by legislature, and the national judiciary had the power to veto legislative acts, declare them unconstitutional, which is how we use it nowadays. And they also had something unique. It was called a Council of Revision. It was a combination of the executive and members of the judiciary, and it had the power to veto congressional legislation. That really seems convoluted, but that's what it was. Now, Patterson developed a small states plan. We essentially today call this the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan also had separation of powers, but instead of having a bicameral legislature, it had a unicameral legislature. It had equal representation for each state. It had it also gave the Constitution additional powers. The national government could now enforce tax assessments, and they could also regulate interstate commerce. That's a huge thing. Believe it or not, that is a huge thing. They would also have what's known as a plural executive, which means that there was more than one. And that plural executive, or executives, could be were not only selected by Congress, but they could be removed by Congress. And the federal judiciary, there was a Supreme Court, or what they called also a tribunal, which sounds Roman, and Congress was responsible for the appointment, the executive branch was responsible for the appointment of members to the Supreme Court. There were major stumbling blocks between the two plans. First and foremost was the issue of representation. New Jersey was equal, Virginia was unequal. But Virginia was more fair because it's based on population, and irregardless of the number of states that existed. So what they came up with was the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise is also known as the Great Compromise. In it, we pretty much have what we have today. We have a bicameral legislature, representation by population in the House of Representatives, equal representation, which means 2, for each state in the Senate. There was a directive that there would be a national census conducted every 10 years so that the House of Representatives could be reapportioned. Fast-growing states would get more congressmen. Slow-going states would lose some congressmen. So they were able to resolve that, but they were not able to resolve slavery any more than just the adoption of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, the slavery, of course, had support in the southern states, and the southern states wanted the slaves to count for representation. That would boost the number of congressmen that they had. The northern states said, no. We don't really want that, but if we are going to count slaves, then you're going to have to pay taxes on those slaves. And the South said, no, we don't want to do that. So the compromise was the Three-Fifths Compromise. Support in the southern states came from counting 3/5 of a slave for representation. Support from the northern states came from counting 3/5 of the slaves for taxation purposes. Whew, that's a tough one. So political equality and voting was left to the states. So this was the first hurdle that occurred. Now the economic issues had to be taken care of. First and foremost, that means that we had to take care of commerce. And that meant that under the Great Compromise, or under the way the Constitution was written, the national government was granted the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, and that was specifically given to Congress itself. That was supported by northern business interests. But at the same time, Southerners feared the national government's power in Congress because though they supported they supported aspects of it. For instance, they supported import duties by the national government, and they did that because their major export that would gain money for the country was not cotton, but at the time tobacco. But what they were afraid of, and what was actually written into the Constitution eventually, was an intervention by Congress to stop the slave trade. And what comes out of the Constitution is an agreement to stop the slave trade after 1808. It doesn't end slavery, but it does mean that no more importation of slaves from outside the United States. And in the executive branch, there was a lack of trust, to say the least. But before we get to that, let's look at what is here on the screen. Remember that we had 14 currencies at the time. There was no dollar bill. Paper money is worthless. Congress couldn't raise money. And the commerce portion of the Constitution takes care of those issues. Now, this is another example of a 1994 question. This is what you're going to be looking at. And this is actually one that is geared toward what we're just talking about. So the question is, as originally ratified, the U.S. Constitution included provisions designed to A, limit the importation of foreign manufactured goods, B, increase the economic importance of the agrarian sector relative to that of the manufacturing sector, C, increase the economic powers of the central government, D, expand the states' powers to regulate their own Congress of foreign countries, and E, guarantee the states a greater role in economic policy making. And this is multiple choice questions. So these are the kind of things that you're going to face on the test, not only in class, but in the test next May. And the answer to this, of course, is C, increase the economic powers of the central government. Okay, now, the Constitution has brought us forward to what's missing from the Constitution, which is essentially a Bill of Rights. And the individual rights issues were important, but the problem is they were tired. Getting past the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Great Compromise pretty much made them spent men. But there were some individual rights issues which were written into the Constitution. First and foremost, we have the prohibition against the suspension of habeas corpus, except under extraordinary circumstances. And what that means is you cannot refuse, any government entity cannot refuse to produce the body, writ of habeas corpus. There can be no bills of attainder, which means that you can't. Shoot, I always screw this up. I always want to miss. I always want to change the. And I'm embarrassed. Suddenly I'm having a mind, mind glitch about bills of attainder, individual rights issues. Oh, that's right. I always want to switch the two. Bills of attainder means that you cannot be put in jail without a trial. And ex post facto laws means that you cannot be charged with a law after you commit the crime. And they had to pass a law in order to charge you because the law didn't exist at that time. There were no religious qualifications for office, strict rules of evidence for conviction of treason, and there was a right to trial by jury in criminal cases. So those were the big things. And we know that some of the other things were addressed with the adoption of the Bill of Rights, which they promised to do if ratified. That would be one of the first acts that they do in order to modify the Constitution, was to add the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights existed in almost every state constitution. In fact, it did exist in every state constitution. And so that's why there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression, rights of the accused. They're not talked about, but they will be added in the Bill of Rights. So we see here the backgrounds of it, small farmers, because what happens is there's now a battle between the two, and this is where I'm actually going to stop, because 48 to 59 or 60 talks about the ratification process. We also have something that we need to do with Federalist 51, which is coming up. So I'm going to stop here. I'll upload this to YouTube, and it should be uploaded to Google Class tonight.